The Secret of the Indian by Lynne Reid Banks, Chapter 3, How It All Started. It had started more than a year before with an old tin medicine cabinet. Guion had found a key that fitted it, which had belonged to Omri's great-grandmother, and the little plastic figure of an American Indian that Patrick had given Omri second-hand for his birthday. On that fateful night, Omri had put the Indian into the small metal cupboard and locked it with the fancy key. There was no particular point to this, really. Thinking back later, Omri didn't know why he'd done it. He'd had a thing at the time about secret cupboards, drawers, rooms, hiding places, kept safe from prying eyes, where he could secrete his favorite things, and be sure they'd stay exactly as he'd left them, undisturbed by rummaging brothers or anyone else. But the Indian didn't stay as he'd left it. Some combination of key and cupboard, plus the stuff the Indian was made of, plastic, had worked the wonder of bringing the little man to life. At first, when this happened, Omri, once past the first shock of astonishment, had thought he was in for the fun trip of all time, a little live man of his very own to play with. But it hadn't turned out like that. The Indian, Little Bear, was no mere toy. Omri soon found out that he had a real person somehow magicked into present-day England, from the America of nearly 200 years ago, the son of a chief of the Iroquois tribe, a fighter, a hunter, with his own history and his own culture, his own beliefs and morals, his own brand of courage. Little Bear regarded Omri as a magic being, a giant from the world of the spirits, and was at first terrified of him. Omri could see he was afraid, but the Indian was incredibly brave and controlled, and Omri soon began to admire him. He realized he couldn't treat him just as a toy. He was a person to be respected, despite his tiny size and relative helplessness. And it soon turned out that he was by no means the easiest person in the world to get along with or satisfy. He had demands, and he made them freely, assuming Omri to be all-powerful. He demanded his own kind of food, a long house such as the Iroquois used to sleep in, a horse, although previously he had never ridden, weapons and animals to hunt, and a fire to cook on and dance around. Eventually, he even demanded that Omri provide him with a wife. In addition, Omri had to hide him and protect him. It needed only a little imagination to realize what would happen if any grown-up should find out about the cupboard, the key, and the magic properties, because Omri soon found out that not just Little Bear, but any plastic figure or object would become alive or real by being locked in the cupboard. But he couldn't keep the secret entirely to himself. His best friend Patrick eventually found out about it and lost no time in putting his own little plastic man into the cupboard. And so, Boo-Hoo Boone, the crying Texas cowboy, had come into their lives, complicating things still more, for of course cowboy and Indian were enemies and had to be kept apart until a number of adventures and their common plight, being tiny in a giant's world, brought them together and made them friends and even blood brothers. Omri bought the plastic figure of an Indian girl and brought her to life as a wife for Little Bear, and shortly after that it was decided with deep reluctance by the boys that having three little people in their horses around amid all the dangers that threatened them in the boys' time and world was more than they could cope with. It was just too much responsibility, so they sent them back, for the cupboard and the door key worked also in reverse, transforming real miniature people back into plastic and returning them to their own time. Omri hadn't intended to play with this dangerous magic again. It had been too frightening, too full of problems, and too hurtful. At the end, when he had to part with friends he had grown so fond of. But, as with so many resolutions, this one got broken. About a year later, by which time Omri and Patrick's families had both moved, Omri won a prize in an important competition for a short story. The story he wrote was called The Plastic Indian, and was all about, well, it was the truth, but of course no one thought of that. They just thought Omri had made up the marvelous tale, and he was so excited. The prize was £300. He was to receive it at a big party in a London hotel, and even his brothers were impressed that he decided to bring Little Bear back to life, just long enough to share this triumph with him, since he had been such a vital part of it. Unfortunately, things were not so simple. When Omri put Little Bear, Bright Stars, and their pony, the plastic figures of them, back in the cupboard, they emerged much changed. Little Bear lay across the back of the pony with 2 musket balls in his back, very near death. There had been a battle in his village between his tribe and their enemies, the Algonquins, together with French soldiers. Omri had already learned that the French and the English had been fighting in America at the time, and Little Bear's tribe was on the English side. Little Bear had been wounded. Bright Stars, also on the point of having a baby, had rushed out and heaved Little Bear onto his pony, just as the magic worked, bringing them, tiny as before, but as real as ever and in desperate trouble, to Omri's attic bedroom. And thus it was that Omri was launched into a whole series of new and even more hair-raising and challenging adventures. Luckily, Patrick was nearby and was able to help with some excellent ideas. Boone came back too, and they also brought to life a hospital matron from a much more recent era to help save Little Bear's life. Later, when he demanded to go back to his village, a Royal British Marine Corporal, Willie Ficketts, and a contingent of Iroquois braves were brought to life to help take revenge on the Algonquins. At this point, there was a most incredible turn of events. Boone, the cowboy, suggested that the boys go back to Little Bear's time and witness the battle. Of course, they thought it was impossible. How could they fit into the little bathroom cupboard, only about a foot high? But Boone pointed out that the magic key might fit something larger. The old seaman's chest that Omri had bought in the market, for instance. It worked. Each boy climbed in turn. The other one turned the key, and each separately went back in time to the Iroquois village. When Omri got back, terribly shaken, after witnessing a horrific battle, his hair was singed and he had a burn blister on the side of his head. The boys brought the Indian troop back through the magic of the key, discovering, to their horror, that the modern weapons they had given Little Bear's men, Little Bear called them now guns, had proved too much for fighters accustomed to bows and arrows. Many of them had been accidentally shot by their own side. Matron had to be brought back to treat their wounds, but 8 had been killed. Little Bear was distraught, but Bright Stars comforted him by putting his new son, Tall Bear, in his arms. And Omri and Patrick took the blame. They shouldn't have sent modern weapons into the past. But these worked very well when later 3 skinheads tried to burgle the house. The boys brought some plastic marines to life and mounted an artillery assault on them just as they were rifling Omri's parents' bedroom, and completely routed them. It was exhilarating while it lasted, and now they were faced with the aftermath reality, the present, the results of the night's doings. And that's the end of Chapter 3.